Greetings, fellow seekers of the Mirrored City. I am the Lord Kragan, and I try to bring you a few insights that will hopefully help you last longer in your forays in the forbidden city of Shadespire. Each day that passes draws us closer to the release of Warhammer Underworlds Online. Thus, we draw closer to the conclusion of our tips regarding the deck building. Today, we go on to cover the last of the three segments, one that is incredibly important, though its effects are not as dramatic as the first two. I am talking about upgrades. Upgrades play a very important role, in that they are very essential into the late game. They provide effects that are permanent across the match, provided the fighter you are equipping them to survives and lasts that longer. They don't provide something as dramatic as flashy as ploys, and they certainly will not make or break your game, first and foremost, like objectives, but nevertheless, upgrades are the workhorse, because they will keep you solidly in your gains. If you manage to get a bridgehead against your opponent, to get an advantage, an edge, upgrades will help you solidify that advantage. They are meant to help you get better once you've gained an edge. And I'm going to drone a bit about this because it's important to know this. They are meant for the late game, because at the very beginning of the match, you'll not be able to equip that many upgrades. At best, by the end of the first round, you may be able to equip 2 or so upgrades. And you certainly will not be able to equip an upgrade unless you have a very specific build at the very beginning of the match. But I am digressing and almost ranting. Just let me check something. Yep. Before we go deeply into the matter of upgrades, we must answer a question, which is, what is a strong fighter? Why am I asking this question? Because understanding what makes a fighter tick is important, because it will shift your paradigm in what upgrades, on how you equip upgrades onto your fighters. So let's go into the details. The first thing to note is that Shadespire has two types of stats. The first is defensive stats. Well, the first is offensive stats. Let me get that way because it's easier. Offensive stats are basically the number of die you will throw whenever you attack, and what do you need to attack. So a fighter with a reliable attack, or a good offensive in that aspect, will have at least 2 die that hit on hammers or 3 die that hit on daggers. That way you get a solid shot at wounding your opponent, of high-end success, of maybe getting things through. But really what matters in offense is the amount of damage you do. That is, whenever your attack gets through, how much life points you take away. That means how efficient you are in taking out of action your opponents. In this case, a strong fighter will have 3 damage points in their attack actions, or 2, but have another special rule. For example, maybe they have cleave and thus ignore shields or something like that. Maybe they provide extra effects on a critical, or maybe they have 2 of range, for example. The idea is that, generally speaking though, you want 3 damage, because that way you'll be able to take out of action most of the weaker fighters. Which brings us on to the second kind of stats, the defensive stats. The first of the defensive stats is the amount of dice you roll for defense, as well as a quality. Generally speaking, you have a reliable defense if you have at least a shield die or 2 dodge die, because you have a solid chance at surviving, at least half and half. But what is very important is the amount of wounds in defense, because Shadespire is a game that rewards offense versus defense. Just look at the cards here. In both cases, you'll have more dice chucked at the attack than being thrown in defense. So chances are quite likely that the hit is going to land. So you want to take the hit head on, and that's why it's important that you have at least 4 wounds. 4 wounds makes or breaks a character being strong in terms of defense. Anything else is frail, it's weak on defense. Why? Because most fighters have at best 3 damage. There's only one that base has 4, and that's Fuel, and Fuel, the leader of the Fire Slayers. But that only happens whenever he's inspired. And I know him being a bit ranty, but it's to settle the concept. Upgrades is something that really requires these bases. Thus, whenever you build a character, 4 full life points are going to be essential for defense, because it means that they will not die with a single action, with a single activation, or will require your opponent to play ploys. But in that case, you were screwed from the get-go, even if you had less. But 4 wounds gives you certainty you will survive a mistake, which is bound to happen because offense is more reliable than defense in this game. With this said, we need to jump onto the first thing to say, and that is mulligan upgrades away. There's a few fringe cases, but if you're a new guy, you should mulligan away a hand that is only objectives. That is only upgrades. Upgrades require you to score objectives previously, and in the early game, you will not be able to score immediately. You are losing a lot of momentum. Maybe you lose steam in the late game, but unless it's something incredibly essential, you want to get rid of a hand that is virtually only upgrades, or 4 upgrades and a ploy. Maybe if that ploy is a card that allows for milling, maybe keep the upgrades. But if you have 5 or 4, unless you're pretty desperate to keep those upgrades, do not. Upgrades are meant to give you mulligan, to allow you to cycle through the deck and get those cards you desire. I mean, it's a bit of risky, but it's something that you must consider, because the early game will snowball and affect both the mid and late game. So it's important to have a good early game in this aspect. With this ranting, we go into the actual recommendations. The first is for fighters that have weak offense, and is to seek out weapon cards. Weapon cards are important to weak fighters in terms of offense because they will switch up their stat lines. For example, remember Arnold. Okay, he has 2 dice, hitting on daggers, and 1 damage. There's no amount of buffing the stats that will make that worthwhile. But if you provide an entirely different stat line, those weak fighters all of a sudden can become a powerhouse on their own right. Be they fighters that have plenty of defense, for example, some of the weaker members of Iron Skull's Warben, or even some of the weaker Fire Slayers. With a good upgrade of a weapon, they can become forces to be reckoned with. Then you may be able to bolt upgrades that improve stats at them. But first and foremost is important to give them weapons. If you want to bother upgrading them, that's another thing to say. Upgrades, you must have a clear idea on what do you intend to use the fighter for. If you want to use a fighter with weak offense, again, you want to equip a weapon, because that way you get a worthwhile stat line. You will not waste your power cards and glory on a very mediocre or dismal stat line into making it slightly less sacky. With this said, we jump on to the second tip, which is meant for fighters with weak defense. Don't get too attached. As I said, fighters that have 2 or 3 wounds are liable to die in a single blow from stronger fighters, especially so if we are talking about fighters that have only 2 wounds. So for example, you are fighting the Stormcasts from the Liberator Warben, Steel Hearts Champions, which are one of the 2 starting Warbens in Warhammer Underworlds online. Okay, if you have 2 wounds, every single attack is going to kill you. So don't bother too much. Maybe an upgrade if you want to use them for a specific thing in that moment as a suicide attack. But don't get too attached. Don't bother too much. Don't bring in too much apples into that one basket. Or one egg on that basket, whatever is the expression really. With this said, though, it may be of interest if you equip a few upgrades in this case to, rather than making your fighter more resilient, which will only be a marginal increase and will not suffice against strong fighters, because remember, a strong fighter does 3 damage if you have 2 life points. A further 1 wound will matter jack shit, really. In this case, it may be interesting to do some trade-offs, and rather than making you more resilient, be harder to be hit, improve the reliability of your stats, of defensive stats, or decrease the reliability of your opponent's offensive stats, so he gets a harder time. That's something to consider if you want to use weaker fighters in terms of defense. Again, let's hammer home the point. These are depending on whether or not you want to use that specific fighter. Now we will jump onto the matter of strong fighters, be it in terms of defense or offense. In these cases, it's worthwhile to seek to increase your stats, because again, if you are a fighter with a strong defense, further increasing it will mean that you'll be invulnerable to tricks from your opponent. Maybe your opponent got a ploy to deal you further damage with a 3 damage attack. But if you have 5 wounds rather than 4, you will still be able to survive that. Furthermore, attacks that only do 2 damage will require all of a sudden 3 actions. So by investing in increasing your stats with a strong fighter, you increase the action economy usage, how intensive, how ineffective it is to kill them. It gives you really a certainty in that you're foiling your opponent's plans because he's wasting too much effort in a single task. Conversely, fighters that do have a strong offense will be able to get a better melee edge even against stronger fighters. It's basically an arms race. If you are a strong fighter, you want to keep being stronger, so your opponent, even if he improves his defense, is unable to save himself. And if you are a fighter with strong defense, I mean having 4 wounds, you want to increase your wound count, so even if the opponent increases the offense, you may be able to survive. This is the basic idea. If you have strong stats, go for the arms race, go for the increasing of stats. Do not seek other weapons, do not seek other stat lines, it's not worthwhile. Now we will go into the universal tips, things that are useful for all kinds of fighters. Movement cards are neat, like always. That's the first tip. Because if you remember what we were saying in the ploys video, basically you have a very limited strategic depth. If you are able to equip upgrades that increase your mobility, you will be able to reach farther, reach opponents that were safe previously, or be able to put distance between you and your opponents, or reach positions you want to reach. That's something to take into account. But when we are speaking about upgrades that increase mobility, I'm talking about something more unconventional. I'm talking about alternate means of mobility. For example, shifting image, where if you attack and get a critical roll, you may be able to push a fighter 1x. What is the usage of this? It means that you're able to get away from your opponent, get out of harm's way. There's another example though, like counter charge, which is basically do a move whenever your whenever opposing fighter charges one of yours. The idea with this type of cards is not so much as increasing your move stat, which is welcome, but also providing you alternate means of mobility outside your activation tokens, both to put your fighters out of harm's way, both to increase your tactical depth, and to foil your opponent's plans. Now we move on to the second universal tips. Trade-offs are acceptable if they benefit your desired stats. Again, this goes a bit onto what I was saying before when talking about fights with weak defense. Increasing the number of wounds, in a few cases, it might not be useful if you are pretty weak. So it's desirable maybe to increase your defense to make your successes more reliable, or decrease your opponent's offense to make his successes more scarce. By the same token, fighters that have pretty good mobility, for example, maybe interested in trading off some of that mobility by a further increase in resilience. For example, a pretty interesting combo that's been used here pretty often is using Screech, using hidden passages, which is basically ignore depth. You go basically to the other field in a second, and then equipping him with Deadly Fortitude. He gets to move 3 tiles still, but he has 6 wounds, and that's a bitch to remove. Well, there's techniques to remove that amount of fighters. Anti-Moloch techniques are pretty successful nowadays, but it's still annoying. And if your opponent doesn't know you're going for that kind of build, maybe be caught off guard. But nevertheless, this goes a bit on what I'm saying. If you want to make things harder for your opponent, it's interesting to trade off maybe Woundage for defense, because he was going to die anyway from an attack. But the idea is this: if it's in a stat that you want to prioritize to max out, maybe minimizing other stats is desirable. Of course, within certain limits, because there's the whole rule of decreasing gains and the like. This is the basis. If you want to increase a specific stat at all costs, it's interesting to maybe decrease one of your stats. That's an idea. That's something that is food for thought. Now we jump onto the third tip, that is universal. One-use upgrades are potent and useful. Take them into account. There's some items, upgrades, that only happen once per game, and then they are moved. These are essentially ploys with a price tag added into them, and they usually have very potent effects. For example, Potion of Grace here allows you to move twice, or Potion of Rage, which adds you 2 attacks, or total offensive not, but that's another thing. Still, one-use items, upgrades, can be useful. Maybe they are not as flexible as ploys, but they have effects that are indeed about as flashy, as important, as potent, and impactful as them. So taking them into account. I'm not saying you should pick them, because upgrades are something that is incredibly freeform. It really will depend on what kind of style you want to do, on what kind of fighters you want to prioritize. But one-use items are interesting. They are fairly useful. Now we jump onto the fourth tip. Upgrades that give glory can be interesting. There's a few upgrades that if you meet these conditions, they will give you further glory. For example, there's Tome of Offerings, which is if you kill an opponent, you gain another glory point. And then there's another objective, another tome, another upgrade that if you are with an objective, yes, you get another glory point. In fact, the most potent build in the story of Warhammer Underworlds, which was the Cut of Rain's Turtle, basically revolved around using upgrades that gave you glory for a whopping 4 glory per action, and you could use it multiple times a turn. So you would rack up an offensive amount of glory. But the idea is this: items, upgrades that give you further glory basically improve the efficiency of your actions. This is especially true if the actions you want them to do align with your preconceived strategy and battle plan. For example, say you want to play an offensive deck with Garrick. Okay, then increasing the amount of glory you get with Garrick is incredibly interesting, because you will be able to reap a lot more glory. Rather than getting 1, you double up, because you get 2, plus as many glory points you will get from kills on other opponents. So again, the upgrades are something that is very, very freeform. It will depend on what kind of fighters you want to prioritize. But I hope this has been useful, that this has been a guideline that gives you an idea, at least on how to apply upgrades on the specific types of fighters and the categories, as well as what things it may be in your interest to include in your deck of upgrades whenever you build them. So again, I bid you farewell, and I hope your forays into the forbidden city of Shadespire are fruitful. Regan out.